Hi, Fred. I tend to call you conference report, but I don't want it to be impersonal. This has gotten touchy, and frankly, I enjoy that. I enjoy the ability to come and disagree so strongly with someone I respect, and tend to not have that opportunity. Even when we disagree, I tend to see, oh, that's conference report's take on it. Interesting. I have a different take, but you know, it's not like there's something in there where, well, look, you have an error. You know, I don't have any. Engage on that, though I enjoy, you know, listening. I think that's good, but I do believe in the conversation and the engagement part of this. Okay, so I respect you a great deal. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in this discussion that do not at all match how I characterize you in my head, you know. Well, the first thing I wanted to talk about is something you brought up at the end of your video.
You have a tendency to psychoanalyze. Do you know that, Piro? In your last video, or maybe there was the comments, you have a tendency to attribute psychological motivations to my videos. Do you know that? It's interesting. I think in this one you referred to me as running away from the argument. And in a previous set of comments you talked about I don't know, some kind of psychological motivation why I might hold certain opinions and I might be expressing certain views. Might be worth considering.
Well, I do consider that, Fred, and I do admit that I do that. I consider my own motivations. I admit that. I resist, you know, and consciously try to control that. I made videos on this where, you know, I explain how I think that internet conversation, you know, eventually gets to a point where all you can have is a psychological conversation. Why is that? Well, because if you dig underneath philosophy deep enough, you get to what we call psychology usually. But you know, I don't think it's really fair the way you're presenting that, because first of all, those things that you said I said to you don't seem very, you know, insulting in any way. And you could compare it with, I was saying plants could be conscious, talking about consciousness, and you made a video, it's all about the meat, right? We talked a little bit about the consciousness, which I was not in the vegetarian conversation. And you said I would just had this view to justify my own meat eating. Does that sound psychological or potentially, you know, maybe insulting? Also, in this very video.
Okay, a quick response to Piro 314, why you need consciousness. Yeah, I'm quite happy to use the word consciousness, you're absolutely right. I'm just thinking it's used in different ways for different purposes. And the way it's used is slippery, and it's often used strategically. Sometimes by yourself, Piro, to cover gaps in your argument.
Slippery, strategically.
So yeah, I do think that you're evading issues by yes, I use consciousness, and you go in your video and you say, you know, you see this consciousness radially, and you have consciousness, you know that. Actually, you say, you know, all the humans have it, and you're willing to see the radius out to your dog maybe, but you know that plants don't have it. So this term that you don't know what it means, but you know whatever it means, you want it to be, especially for humans, radially, maybe given out to those that are close enough to us, radial. E. You don't know what it means, but whatever we end up making it mean, you know it better only really be humans. Well, because I made a video breaking down the language. I don't know, a lot of people won't get how I did it, but that's my approach to, yes, the language is slippery. We need to put some handles and make it less slippery. And I'm saying that you're kind of running from the issue. That's sort of a more mild way of saying you're being slippery with the term. Okay, so I put it a more nice way. But what's important to me is that we put whatever we think up there. So I'm not going to worry about this. I'm already conscious about so-called psychological comments. Those that you identified, I don't think necessarily are psychological. This is an intellectual thing. Words have definitions. If in some modes they mean this, in other modes they mean this, and you go, here is what I'm talking about, and then boom, now it's this. Okay. It's not definable, but I know that plants don't have it. How could you know that? That's what I'm saying. How could you know that? Okay. I have some concrete definitions to offer, because if you break something down like consciousness, one thing you find is that sometimes there's concrete sub-meanings in there, but it's like it's hooked with rubber bands to bags of jelly and other concrete meanings, and it's hard to handle. You can sever those connections and you can end up, well, here's a version of consciousness that at least it might miss some of the stuff, the poetry or whatever, the less concrete contributions could still be important, is my point. But you can settle down there and get some concreteness about some part of what you're talking about. And that's what I'm doing and proposing. So let's just leave that, okay?
Slippery, and it's often used strategically, sometimes by yourself, Piro, to cover gaps in your argument, but more by people like Deepak Chopra, who was at it before. He uses it as a kind of universal solution for everything he wants to talk about. Now, I'm using it I'm using it, but I'm critiquing it in two ways, or I'm using it in two ways and critiquing the misapplication of it. And as I said in a previous video, I would regard consciousness as a radial category with, marked by prototypes and family resemblances. And for those entities which are in the middle of a radial category, there's no doubt that these things are absolutely typical forms. You know, as I said, I firmly believe that you have consciousness. I know that I have from the inside, and I'm the most prototypical example of my own definition of consciousness.
Well, this is what I'm talking about. Now, I know this sounds arrogant, conference report, but I am not often, arrogant, at least not in this way. I really think you are missing an important distinction I diagrammed in my breakdown of consciousness. That you have a subjective feeling of consciousness, and then you notice other things having conscious behavior. These don't have a radial relationship. They are different in kind. The radial relationship in terms of the consciousness you feel into things that also feel consciousness, it's not quite like you feel, but is similar. That's what you were talking about, how we change over time. How my consciousness now isn't the same as my consciousness, now a few seconds later. If you sever your brain and you have two halves of your brain and it looks like they're each conscious, or one of them's conscious, or whichever, these are radial relationships there. It never gets to the objective version where you notice what we call conscious behavior. Now, I did this analysis by asking myself, what do we call conscious? See, there's an example of consciousness. What is that? One is we're pointing to our own ideas, our own feelings, that we only know for ourselves. The radial structure goes into breakdowns of ourselves, subjective feelings that we or parts of us can feel. Whereas observing behavior of conscious things, that's different. When you observe it in a human, the human is so like you, that can be the root of a radial structure there. And that radial structure then is the one that goes into other that takes all humans at once and then goes into mammals and potentially to all life.
I suspect my dog has, I'm slightly less sure, and I don't know about lots of other animals, but I'm sure that plants and bacteria and machines don't have that quality that I'm talking about.
I know I'm repeating myself, conference report, but I just don't see how you could possibly stand on the position that there isn't a definition, but you're sure it doesn't apply. Because to me, you're just saying that you want to use that word for something that applies only to humans. Whether or not technically and physically it has similarities or not. Whether you can technically make that decision, it's got to be, it's a requirement, a boundary condition, if you will, that as we focus in on a better definition of consciousness, it has to only apply to humans, your dog, and maybe other animals. That does not seem like a proper way to go about finding a definition and concept, a material concept for something.
So in that level, I can use consciousness. Certainly I can use it with a degree of stability to describe those entities which demonstrate prototypicality and are therefore at the centre of that radial category. I have no problem with that. it's when you start talking about plants having consciousness or some other term that relates to consciousness, that's when it becomes problematic, and it should become problematic for you, quite frankly.
This report, I do consider it problematic. It is, in fact, the problem that I'm addressing right now. I don't think that it's insolvable. I don't think that it's impossible. It is a problem. That is what I'm trying to sort out. And I have expended a considerable amount of thought on this, and I believe I have sorted some of the things out that you were asserting are impossible to sort out. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has them sorted out or that they can adopt my view, but then again, I'm in the position of, yes, it's a problem. It's a problem. Parts of it can be sorted out quicker than other parts. Let's talk about those parts. Not that we're not. I suppose we are. So let's continue.
Because prototypical, those categories which are marked like that do have very fuzzy boundaries, and that's where all the interesting stuff happens for sure, but it's also where definitions become really, really difficult. Yeah, so that's one aspect of it. So I'm happy to use the word consciousness, but only to refer to examples which lie well away from the edge of that category, because there isn't really an edge, it's a fuzzy boundary.
What I'm saying, conference report, in your own language, it's interesting you said there isn't really a boundary, but you think there is, because I say there isn't. It goes all the way out to the edge of life. You say, and that would still make it fuzzy, because what's life? Are viruses alive? Okay, but things like paramecium makes it simple. They're in the easy set. But the thing is, I will say again, there are two different categories. In this category of subjective experience, only you yourself are in that set, and things that are arguably a part of yourself, right? So yourself now and yourself in a year, those two consciousnesses have a radial relationship. Okay, but it's entirely solipsistic, other than encompassing both you over time and parts of yourself, this half of your brain, this part of your brain, if it breaks down that way at all. Okay. It only includes parts of yourself. It's solipsistic. Then there's another category of things that behave. Now, you're also in that category if you watch yourself in a mirror, if you take a video camera of yourself, you behave consciously. So you make a link, but that link is not radial. That link is just a metaphorical link. I feel this way. I look this way. They look this way. Therefore, they feel this way. Okay. But that's somewhat of an illusion. Really, it's two different categories. You have lots of relationships of your own consciousness, subjective style, and then this other thing. So really, the category that you're talking about maybe I know my dog, well, maybe you know other people. The solipsistic argument is, it can't be escaped. It can't be escaped from. In the case where we're discussing subjective consciousness, because subjective consciousness is locked in. Only your own consciousness and parts of that consciousness in your body, in yourself, whatever that gets defined. So the definitions are still fuzzy, because what is yourself, and etc., etc. But they never go into the granting consciousness to other agents. It does not generate agency. A breakdown in radial analysis of your own consciousness does not generate agency, except possibly in your ancestors and your descendants. Okay. So it's like inertial mass and gravitational mass. There's a lot of things making them look the same, and in the end it looks like, yes, they turn out that they're linked. Nobody's ever been able to split them up, because if your consciousness can be materially linked to the consciousness of your descendants, then that's enough of a separation between you and your descendants to grant agency to other individual humans, which some of them are living with you now, and they are related to you in the past. So you have a common ancestor, and ancestors led to your agency, could lead to their agency, and so forth. So there's lots of logic, but it's still two different categories. And there is no way to establish that agency that you feel for yourself or other people, because it's behavioral. You look at the behavior of all physical systems, right? and genetics and everything, you see these links, right? But you're always looking at a behavior, at some picture coming to you that you then are interpreting as, you know, in this framework of consciousness where you have drawn a similarity to your own subjective consciousness through analogy. But in reality, there's never actual evidence of that consciousness in other people. This is the point of it. You could be in a simulation, your brain's plugged into something else. And this is not a suggestion that this is really ever true, but it's just a thought point to draw back to. You could be given a bunch of movies of other people and they wouldn't have to have agency. Now probably they do have agency, just like probably gravitational mass is fundamentally linked to inertial mass, and at some point we'll put them both in the same terms. Okay.
The other way I talk about it, and this is a kind of internal critique, is, for example, in the video that I made about comparing consciousness to the motricity or the motility of a car, and talking about people's tendency to essentialize consciousness, and talk about it as if this car had, you know, rather than break the car down to its moving components, you would just say, it's got this special quality of motricity about it. Yeah, I think people do that, and I think you do that sometimes, to be frank, Pero.
Conference report, you're going to have to do better than that, because I'm one of the most staunch critics against essentialism. I say all things are systems, and you might be used to making that argument, but it's not going to work against me. It probably works with other people because people have a lot of latent essentialism. But I don't. I've got it cleared out. When I talk of something like consciousness, it's a feature of a system, just like explaining why is that thing red, and I say, well, because it's reflecting light, and you go, no, because look, here's something emitting red light. Well, that's red because it's emitting red light. These are features, cross sections of systems, multiple systems. For all I know, there's multiple ways to be conscious. We don't know enough to speak about that. But I'll tell you one thing I know, it's not an essentialism, and I said this in another video and you seem to ignore this. But if we find consciousness is X or Y or Z, in none of those cases is it going to be an essential quality. It's like, look, the thing is red. Why? Because it's glowing, because it's reflecting, because it's a prism and we're seeing the red band, because, you know, it's an explanation of how a system's behaving. That's what consciousness is going to be. We have this subjective experience and we're trying to explain it. It's a system. It breaks down into systems of systems of systems.
And that's what happens when you refuse to acknowledge that it's a variable category.
So, considering what I've been saying, in what way am I refusing it's a variable category? Other than I don't know exactly what you mean by a variable category.
It's different, with different components, which is, you know, the other thing about it.
So I think I'm making pretty clear, and I did in my other video breaking down the word consciousness, that I am looking at components. That I've made videos you may or may not have seen separate from it all being about me, about components inside microtubules possibly, according to Hameroff's theory and Penrose's theory. You know, I'm looking at components. I think I made that pretty clear.
If you deal with it phenomenologically in the first way I've talked about, then yes, you can treat consciousness as a single entity, just like you can treat motion as a single entity. You can't talk about motion, you can make physical laws of motion, you can compare the motion of one car to the motion of another, it's no problem at all.
Well, I'm sorry, conference report, but I think you totally mistake. You cannot talk about those, just because there's a single word doesn't mean it's a single thing. Like red, again, it doesn't, as if it's a single thing. No, it becomes, it's unified into something that can be talked about with a single word because it creates a common excitement in, you know, our eyeballs. So it's red. Consciousness, there's this sensation of agency, agency being the more objective term, but of personal agency. There's this feeling of that we're trying to explain. And it's just like red or anything else. It can never be treated as if, phenomenologically, as if it's a thing. Motion isn't a thing. It's a property of a thing. Absolutely a property of a thing. And that's, relativity says that. It says there's no just motion, it's relative motion of actually multiple things.
But when you go into the detail, then you have to break, you know, to find out how a car works and to find out how consciousness works. Then you have to go into the details. So that's the way I'm using it differently.
no, Fred, that's not differently. You're trying to take the high ground as if you were breaking it down, but you're the one that's saying it's just a muddle. I'm the one breaking it down.
Consciousness as a phenomenological entity, I would say you have to work with those organisms that you are absolutely sure have the consciousness that that fit the description that you're having. And right now, the only ones that really do fit that are you and I and the rest of humans.
This is an important part where we differ, you see, because that subjective feeling of consciousness, only you have. There's nobody that has anything similar to you, as far as you know, because you can't see them having it. Separate from the behavioral. Now, if you watch your behavior and put yourself as though you're looking in a mirror, or, this is technology. For millions of years, you could not really watch your own behavior except for maybe watching yourself drink water. So you can't extend that subjective personal feeling to other people. They could be like a movie can record that kind of behavior, and they cannot be sentient, not have a subjective internal reality. So you can't actually do that just so directly. And I'll make a video to chart out how we do it so that it's more clear where the radial clustering prototyping parts are and where the bridges of analogy are constructed, or is constructed.
I would extend that out into the animal kingdom a bit with, but yes, I'm talking about the way that these things interrelate is one thing. But going into the details and saying what is consciousness, then you're dealing with fringe, border, or beyond the fringe.
Well, what I would request from you is, you say there's a fuzzy border. Right, all borders are fuzzy. You understand cognitive categorization and cognitive science, and so they're always blurry. What you have to do is you have to say what's certainly in it. You said maybe your dog, so maybe your dog's in it. So it's already blurry at your dog. So what about mice? I mean, just tell me where. They don't have to be right next to each other. You don't have to say this one and this one. One's conscious, one's not, and they're right next to each other. It could be, okay, your dog, and then what's the first thing that isn't conscious in the animal kingdom? A bee? What? Invertebrates?
I would vote for going in there and looking at and taking the engine apart and looking at the details of it, or at least talking about the interesting components of the engine.